My name is John Turner. Welcome to the NYU Bookstore. We're really happy that all of you are here. Just have a very few quick notes before we begin. This is the second event of our new spring season. Please keep an eye out on our schedule and come back again. There's some very cool things happening here. While I'm doing this boring introduction, please take a moment and do me a quick favor and take your electric gizmos out of your pocket and turn it into a silent mode. We would all appreciate that. I'm trying to keep this part of the night super concise because, as you can see, we have a lot of people up here. We want to give enough time for everyone to say what they need to say, and for you as well. If you're here, you probably have at least some inkling of who Susan Shapiro is. Welcome back. In the interest of saving time, she will take care of introducing everyone. And we have a great panel of writers here tonight who have produced some excellent books, and they're all here to be with you. It's very cool. Speaking of the books, I will now draw your attention to the looming, imposing pile of books across the front of this table. This is a bookstore. We are here to sell the books to you. At the end of the event, we'd very much appreciate it if you would consider purchasing a book or 6. The cash registers here are all the way in the very front of the store where you came in. Now, I'm not going to make you walk all the way up there one city block to buy a book and then walk all the way back here to get it signed. At the end, honor system, okay, just get your book, have them sign it, just remember to buy it on the way out and we'll be all cool. I guess one more thing, when we open the floor for discussion, if you would please wait until someone who looks very much like me pretends to be Phil Donahue and hands you this microphone. So without further ado, Susan Shapiro.
Thank you so much to John Turner. Not only am I an NYU alumni grad and I love doing events here, but I live across the street, so he can't get rid of me. And thanks to David Varnado, who's my NVCC friend, who's taping this. So everybody who knows me knows my favorite thing to do when I do these panels is to invite the most brilliant editors and agents and authors that I know and ask them all the questions that we're dying to know about writing and publishing. And then what we're going to do is, first I'll ask questions. Then I have, in my new book, I was able to reprint 60 pieces that people from my classes and workshops published. So we have 4 people that are going to read really short pieces, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So I'm going to do the introduction. So all the way to my left, we have Serene Hakim, who's an agent on Aisha Pandey Literary Agency, who represents YA, fantasy, adult literary fiction, and nonfiction. She's interested in international themes that highlight a variety of cultures and focuses on underrepresented and marginalized voices. Her background's in French and women's studies, and she holds a master's in French-English translation from NYU. And next to her is my old Michigan pal, Deborah Garrison, who's the author of 2 acclaimed poetry collections, A Working Girl Can't Win Another Poems, and The Second Child. For 15 years, she worked on the editorial staff of The New Yorker. She's now the poetry editor at Alfred Knopf and a senior editor at Pantheon Books, doing fiction and nonfiction. Her reviews and poems have appeared in the New York Times Book Review, New Yorker, Slate, Yale Review, and Poets and Writers, and she lives in Mount Clair, New Jersey. Next to her is Melissa Dahl, who's been an editor at New York Magazine's The Cut for 5 years. I had the honor of doing an It's Complicated piece for her recently. Before that, she was a health writer at NBC News and Today.com and the Sacramento Bee. Her debut book, Cringeworthy, A Theory of Awkwardness, was published this year by Portfolio, where she unearths the reasons why we wince, flinch, recoil, and offers advice on how social discomfort can stop haunting us. Next to me is my Newsday editor, Eli Reyes, the deputy editorial page editor for both Newsday and AM New York, where he supervises the editorial board and commissions opinion pieces. Before Newsday, he was at the Washington Post Metro section, and he has published the work of many of my students, me, Kate, but also Liz Montgomery, Angelica Martinez, Ron Bell Bruno, and Now You'll Never Get Rid of Me. Right here next to me is Seth Kugel. He was first published in my class so long ago that he faxed in his first New York Times piece. He then taught an interviewing class at NYU. He spent years at the New York Times Frugal Traveler, which led to his great new book. Hello? Is that up? Is that on?
No.
Is this on? Yes.
Yeah.
Seth Kugel's new book, Rediscovering Travel, A Guide for the Globally Curious, which is recently out from Norton Books. Next to him is Dream Jordan, who's an award-winning young adult author. Her current novel, Love Me or Miss Me, was just published by St. Martin's Books. It chronicles how 14-year-old Kate is navigating the foster care system. Jordan uses a light touch to delve into heavy topics. I met her when she was an undergrad at NYU, where she received her bachelor's in creative writing. Next to her is my colleague Kate Walter, who's a longtime essay teacher at NYU School of Professional Studies. She's the author of the debut memoir, Looking for a Kiss, a chronicle of downtown heartbreak and healing, about how she recovered from breaking up with her girlfriend of 23 years. She's written for the New York Times, Daily News, Newsday, and AM New York. Okay, so I love to be very inspiring to my students, but also to be really honest. So I want to talk about our backgrounds. And a lot of my students think that you just choose a major when you're 21 and then you just get a great internship and it leads to a job and then you figure out your career. So I want to talk about what really happens with careers. So in my own career, I have my master's degree in poetry from NYU. I was a failed poet for 10 years. Couldn't make a living reviewing books. Couldn't make a living doing freelance magazine work. I wasn't funny enough for comedy. Finally, I sold 3 memoirs in my 40s, but none of them sold well. I then sold 3 novels in my late 40s. None of those sold well. Then I wound up co-authoring 3 books that sold a little bit better, and now I make a living freelancing and teaching. Okay, Serene, so let's talk about your background. How did you get from French-English translation at NYU to being a literary agent?
I realized that it's hard to have a career as a translator, not that it's much easier as an agent. But I was doing translations for a French agency, and that was my first, this is a thing in publishing. And I got an internship at a small literary agency, and then a few more internships, and then finally landed a job as an assistant with Aisha, where I am now, and just worked my way up, and now I get to be an agent, so yeah.
So if somebody was interested in becoming an agent, you would say an internship is a good way to start?
Yeah, internship, do informational interviews if you can. I did countless ones when I was first starting out, just to decide even which direction I wanted to go, and that was really helpful.
Fantastic. Okay, Deb Garrison, you studied literature.
Yeah.
And then I remember we worked together at the New Yorker, and I was in the editorial library, and there was a woman named Harriet Walden, and I think you were in Walden's Pond.
Well, they called it Walden's Pond.
Yes.
It was also called the typing pool,
Okay.
as you might remember.
Okay, so tell us
I almost feel like,
tell us
you know
about
what,
it.
I guess when we get to a certain, I feel like I'm so old that what I have to say doesn't apply to the way things are
No,
done
I think
today.
it still does.
Well, because I actually worked as a summer employee at the New Yorker. There kind of was no such thing as an internship then, and we didn't really have that word, and I just wanted to come to New York and spend the summer in New York, and I asked myself, I was in Rhode Island in college, and I asked myself, well, what would be my dream job for this summer? And I thought, I'll write a letter to the New Yorker. Maybe nobody else will think of that. Because they weren't on the career board or anything. It was it seemed like an obscure, it was silly to think of now. But anyway, I wrote a letter saying, do you need summer help? And in fact, they did need summer help because people in that typing pool, the magazine then was, people had to type the copy. There was no electronic, now when you turn in a piece, you just send an email. But then we have these scrappy manuscripts and people had to type. So the typists were this group of people, and they all took summer vacations. So I actually came in to literally type copy for the summer, and that's how I fell in love with being an editor. I mean, I got to work for different editors while I was there. When their assistants went away, I was kind of sent around, and I just fell in love with the editorial process. And I was in the fiction department for a little while, and I was asked to give opinions on stories, and it was just, that was a magical experience. Now today, I don't know, maybe they do have something like
Well, by the way, a lot of
internships.
my students, they do have internships, but a lot of my students, if you have languages and if you have good web skills and good social media skills, you absolutely could get hired either as an intern or as a starting position.
Interesting.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
you still can, and I think the important thing is that you have to do, it's not exciting at the beginning, like we said.
Well, and also I will say, people now would never do what I did then, which is I literally worked at that magazine. I was an assistant, I want to say, for 10 years. I mean, all my friends were doctors and lawyers and had graduate degrees and were, had these incredible careers. And I was still, I did incredible work and I edited writers, but I was still typing the letters of editors who I worked for, and that went on. I mean, I was a really grown-up, older person by the time, because it was almost like a situation where the people in those days, everybody was kind of like a tenured. That nobody went anywhere. People literally had to die for them to promote someone. And anyway, it's all very different now, and there's so much more
by the way,
movement
I don't
and
think
change.
it's different because I think sometimes having to work as an assistant, I mean, I spent 4 years typing.
Yeah.
You know, it's all we did was we typed everything in the magazine and then we glued them into these big scrapbooks. But
I remember the scrapbooks.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important for people to realize that, you know, right out of school, you might have to be a secretary or an assistant or an intern for a while.
For me, it was a
before-
really long
Yeah.
time, and what I was doing at the same time, though, was I actually got my graduate degree from NYU because I could study at night, so I loved doing that, and I was writing poems. So, you know, when I stayed late, I would sit at the little typewriter, and, I was kind of trying to go on multiple tracks at the same time, even though I literally was like a 30-year-old assistant. So.
Yeah, but that's good to know because that's more realistic than somebody 22 landing a great job. You know, that still happens. It takes a long time, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so Melissa, how did you get from, I think I read that you were, you graduated in Sacramento and you were working for the Sacramento Bee and you
Yes.
specialized in health.
Yes.
Okay, tell us how you got here.
You know, I wanted to say, just first of all, that I just think there's something so valuable about hearing about everybody's individual paths. It's true that maybe like the same road doesn't exist anymore. Mine certainly doesn't. There is no one road. It's just so nice hearing from other people. So that's just very earnest. I will start out by saying that. But okay, so how did I get from Sacramento to here? I really wanted to work in newspapers. I really wanted to be a writer, and a journalist felt like a kind of a 9-to-5 way to be that. And I wanted to work in newspapers. It was, you know, like 2005. It was still kind of maybe sort of an option to work in newspapers, but I graduated in 2007. It was very, very quickly not really a viable career path. So I kind of, not on purpose, but I kind of pivoted to the web. And sometimes I feel like my career path has just been me just like following my curiosity. Like I kind of like, well, I got an opportunity to intern in the health department at NBC News at their website, and then I just was like, oh, but I'm really interested in psychology, and then I'm really interested in, you know, maybe like relationships and social dynamics, and so that's kind of how I ended up writing this book and ended up working at New York Magazine. About like 5 years ago, I came on to New York Mag to launch a vertical specifically about social science and human behavior. So that's kind of how I look at my career, just like one long road of just being like, what's that about? What's that about?
Well, but by the way, I think another really smart thing you did was you had a specialty, and I think specializing in health or psychology, that's a really, but these days that's an excellent expertise. So I think that's really helpful.
That's usually advice I like to give people. I did not do it on purpose. I didn't be, you know, it wasn't like, I'm just going to be a psychology writer. I'm going to do that on purpose. But it just, it happened that way. And I'm so glad that it did, because I have this kind of expertise.
That's
cool.
great.
So.
And Eli Reyes, you joked to my class that your immigrant parents wanted you to be a lawyer or a doctor. So what happened?
Yeah, well, it's a typical immigrant story, right? You have to be a doctor, lawyer, you'll starve. Maybe an architect, maybe. But something happened on the way to that. I thought I was going to be a pediatric surgeon. That's what I wanted to do. Math got in the way. But I also, you know, I used to talk about newspapers. I used to listen to news radio. I'm much older. And, with my grandfather and horse races. And as an 8-year-old, I always found it interesting, voices coming out of this box, if you will. It's before Sirius XM, obviously. And 2 years into pre-med, I told my mom at her family kitchen table, it's not going to work. Something called math gets in the way. And I really wanted to do news, and I never looked back since. I knew that's what I wanted to do, but how I got there were steps that were beyond my control, right? You get mentors, bosses, friends who guide you in the right way. In my case, that's I never had a job that was more than 18 months. I was always on another job. The last 2 jobs have been the 2 jobs that I've been at the most, 5 years and 4 years. But it was all accidental.
So were your parents proud when you were working at the Washington Post and Newsday?
They were. My mom really is very proud. But I never made it home because I was a political editor. And if you do politics at the Washington Post, the only free time you have is maybe to sleep. Nothing else. That was the only drawback.
Okay, Seth, I think I remember that you studied, was it public policy before you took my class? So how did you tell us about how did you get to this?
Sure, is this on? Yeah, so I'm going to try to go through these steps very quickly. I studied political science and then did the Teach for America program, in which I taught Dominican kids in the Bronx, at which point I was invited to one of my Dominican kids' homes in the Dominican Republic to spend the summer, at which point I then went to graduate school to study immigration policy, at which point I then worked in the Bronx for the Giuliani administration. And from there I took your class and I started, well, what do I know about? I know about Dominican culture in New York, and I know about the Bronx, and Dominicans are the biggest immigrant group in the Bronx to this day. And so I started writing for the New York Times because I knew everything that was going on in the Bronx. From there, I started doing everything I could for the Times, whatever they would pay me for as a freelancer, and ended up writing a lot of profiles of second home owners. That was really exciting. But it did pay, and the editor was Stuart Emmerich, and he became the travel editor. And the day after he became the travel editor, he said to me, "Where have you been recently?" And I had recently been on a boat going down the Amazon River learning Portuguese, so I did my first travel story. And then a couple years later, he asked me to be the Frugal Traveler columnist, and basically I based every trip I went on the trip I did to my students' parents' home in the Dominican Republic, because that had been the best trip I had ever taken. So I guess the lesson is I used what I knew to become a writer about the things that I was interested in.
Great, and Dream, so I met you at NYU, and you did study creative writing. How did you get from studying at NYU to becoming a YA author?
Well, I'd like to give you the credit for that. So Sue has been very inspirational in my journey. She was the person who led me to my first agent, who was wonderful. But to start, I was an at-risk youth, and I wanted to empower young people to understand that it's okay to be cool in school. And I want to tell you that this is a miracle book, you guys, because it is a reprint of 2 of my novels, Hot Girl and Bad Boy. St. Martin's Press had enough faith to reprint it. And so I wasn't prepared for this question, but I would just say that I am a miracle author and you can do it. Don't give up, because it can happen, but you have to be open to criticism and you have to be confident in your work. So I'll just stop there.
Kate, so I know that you've been a journalist, and then the mic. You've been a journalist, and then for a lot of years, and I know that you teach. You teach, I think English is a second language. You teach essay writing, and then you recently published your. Oh, if you don't mind me saying, I love this. You published your first book, your debut at 66. So I find that really inspirational. So could you tell us a little bit about how you went from from what you studied to being a journalist to being a teacher?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. I started out as a high school English teacher. I did that for about 10 years. I was always freelancing. I started freelancing and writing music reviews when I was still a college student. Then I quit the high school teaching to become a freelancer, and of course I was broke. Then I became an adjunct at NYU, which is where I met Sue, and I also taught at BMCC. I was freelancing the whole time. I taught personal essay, I taught critical thinking, I never taught ESL. I worked for a lot of different papers. Newsday, had a column in New York Press, Daily News, Village Voice. Always freelancing, always selling essays and opinion pieces. I mean, that was sort of my thing, writing opinion pieces. And then I knew I was eventually going to write a memoir, which took a very, very long time to write. It took years to write the memoir. A lot of the essays that are related to the memoir had been published, and it took a long time to write the book, and a long time to find a publisher. And So I would just want to say, don't give up. If you want to have a book, you have to keep going. You can't give up. Don't take rejections personally. Just keep going, keep going, keep going.
Great, and now I'd like to get really specific. So Serene, as a literary agent, I find a lot of people make the mistake where they publish a short piece and they send it to an agent and they say, hey, would you want a book on this subject? Now, most literary agents that I know say, before you contact me, if it's a fictional project, you should write the entire novel should be written and rewritten and really good before you even contact me. Or if you have a nonfiction idea, you should really have a proposal completed. So is that accurate? So you don't want to jump the gun and ruin a connection with a good literary agent before you're ready?
Yes, absolutely. Especially if it's fiction, have final draft. You should have read it a million times. Your friends should have read it. If possible, anyone you can get feedback on it. We're willing to work with you, and we'll do edits on it together. So that point about being open to criticism is really important. But it's still best to have it in as best of shape as you can get it, so that we get it to us, and then we'll turn it even more. I can't speak English today. Get it into even better shape to send to the editors. And then with nonfiction, you come with a proposal. And if you don't know where to start with that, talk to some other friends, talk to professors, Google. But the idea is that we want to see that your idea, that essay or whatever it is, can actually become a book. So you have to think about it from start to finish.
Now, the only time that I would say, the only exception, and I always say to my students, and that's what I write about in Byline Bible, 3 pages can change your life. And one of the exciting things I think about publishing a short piece, especially in some place great like New York Magazine or Newsday or the New York Times, is sometimes agents will see a short piece and they'll be, oh, this is really interesting, and then they'll contact someone. So has that ever happened to you where you've seen a newspaper or magazine piece?
I haven't personally, but I know lots of people do, so yes, that's very true. We're always reading with an eye to, what is this, what can this be, or what else does this writer have, or can this become a book? But, so yes, those few pages can make a big deal.
Because I always think it's hard to, if somebody says they want to do a book, it's really hard to write 300 pages, but it's not that hard to write 3 pages and get it published, which sometimes could lead you on.
But definitely,
journey.
if you're the one doing the querying, have it as finished as possible.
Good. And Deb Garrison, am I correct in thinking that with most of the major publishers that you don't really want to be contacted directly by authors, that you would prefer to be contacted by literary agents most of the time?
I would say most editors expect to be contacted by agents. However, as a poetry editor, I will just say, I don't know if are there any poets here, or should I not even go into this? Oh, okay.
Yes.
So for you couple of poets, I'll just say, I don't expect poets to have a literary agent, because who could make a living representing poetry? So for poetry, people write directly to me, and their cover letter, instead of being through an agent, they say, this is who I studied with, or this is what my work is about. Whatever it is, it's basically your cover letter is direct to me. For fiction, nonfiction, yes, most things come through agents. Because of my weird little corner of being a poetry editor, I'm weirdly a little bit more open, I will say, than probably most editors, to just somebody writing to me and saying, here's my,
On the other hand, because I have a lot of students who do poetry and fiction, if you've never published a poem or you've never published a short story, pitching the editor at Knopf your book is probably not the way to start.
Your resume, in a way, what your calling card is your prior publications in literary journals, in magazines, in both cases in terms of fiction. And the truth about fiction, honestly, is alas, the way our system works in this world now is that if you're a pretty good fiction writer and you've got something going on and you have a beautiful novel, you probably have published in some journals, and probably an agent has noticed you, or you've gotten the attention of an agent. So I think most editors do have the prejudice that, an agent is going to bring, and of course we all have relationships with certain agents, and we know people's taste, and we when certain agents write to me, I kind of know, like, ooh, I really like that person's stuff, and so having an agent is hugely important and helpful, and this is the person who knows you are looking at a landscape of God knows how many editors. You don't know really who to write to, who might like your stuff. The agents kind of do all of that work of filtering and figuring out, well, this is something Deb would like, or this is something somebody else would like. They kind of don't send me the stuff they know I'm not going to, they kind of do all the work for you of saying, these are the 5 people who are going to love your book in this town. So I would say, if you're not a poet, do get an agent, basically.
Right, and again, getting a top agent or getting an editor is really difficult, publishing one short story or flash fiction or a poem or an essay or an op-ed page is absolutely doable. And I teach 5-week classes. I wouldn't necessarily say for a poem that you could publish a great poem in 5 weeks, but I do have quite a few students who have broken into, for example, American Poetry Review, which is a terrific place. There's tons of literary magazines that take short stories, flash fiction, poetry. So that's a great way to start. And quite often you do. It's sort of amazing how quickly you can get attention from agents and editors if you publish in big places. I have many students, in fact, I include 27 pieces. I have many students who in their first piece they ever wrote for the New York Times were called by literary agents and book editors. So it really does happen. So I would say,
get yourself out there. And that involves sending out a ton of stuff all the time. And again, it's this thing of don't take you'll get a ton of rejections, but it only takes one person to like something for it to be published. So, anyway.
Great. And Melissa, quite a few of my students have actually been able to, over the years, break into New York Magazine, and some of them in The Cut. And the Cut has some fantastic sections, including I Love It's Complicated. And it seems like they do a lot of personal essays, and I've seen some good interviews and some kind of provocative third-person pieces. So if somebody's fantasy was to break into The Cut, would you say, aside from reading it really carefully to understand what the different verticals are, what they like, do you think that someone is better off doing a short pitch for like a hot, timely story, or do you think someone might be better off writing an entire essay that fits the format? For example, It's Complicated seems to be like a little bit like Modern Love in that it's maybe 1,000-word piece on something crazy that, very revealing that happened in a relationship. So would you say, do you think it'd be better for someone starting out to pitch something, or would it be better to just try to write an essay?
It's like, I hate to say this because it's a lot of work to ask of somebody, but I'm certainly more apt to go for a submission. It's kind of a risk on my part. I'm such a sucker for a good idea, and so if I get a pitch, I'm like, oh, I love that, yes, let's go for it. And sometimes if it's a newer writer, it comes back and it's just like, it's not quite our tone, it's not quite our style. So yes, I would say these days I love when people send, and actually that's how we take pitches for It's Complicated now. We take full submissions. Yeah, and the other thing, like you were saying about reading the place you're pitching to, I guess The Cut specifically, but any publication would be like this, but we have just such a specific tone that's hard to even articulate. You just kind of have to be reading us all the time and really know it. It's funny and witty and kind of self-aware. So a lot of times when I reject things, it's just because it's just not us. It doesn't seem like us, and you only get that by reading it a lot.
I've had a couple editors who told my class it's really smart if you get a really great headline and a subtitle that so the editor can see it. And I remember at one point when I came up with this title, my writing group helped me. It was I started a secret Facebook friendship with my ex's wife, and everyone was like, I want to read that. Yeah. So would you say if someone's going to send you an essay, that having a good headline might catch your attention?
Yes, that's the way just internally we do pitches here. If I'm working with my staff writers, they'll pitch something to me and I'm like, okay, what's the headline? It helps the writer too. It helps you kind of narrow your focus. It helps you be really, really clear on what the angle is. And for the editor, maybe we're not going to keep the headline you pitched, but it shows us that you really know what the story is. And it shows a little confidence too, I think. So yeah, headline is so key.
Great. And Eli, when you're looking for submissions for Newsday and AM New York, I know that several of my students, including Roundabout Bruno and Liz Montgomery, who are here, they wrote entire op-ed pieces that were aimed specifically at either AM New York or Newsday, and I know they sent you in the piece. And to be really specific, what we talk about is you write a very short cover letter saying what's timely about your piece, again, giving the title, and you attach it and you paste it, and if I'm correct, AM New York has shorter op-ed pieces, which are very opinionated pieces. The prompt I use is, it really pisses me off when, and they're usually 300 or 400 words, and the Newsday pieces seem to be 600 or 700 words on average. And so you write the whole piece and then you send it in. Is that, for writers that haven't been published, that's better than pitching, right?
Yeah, I mean, as a general proposition, yes. Although sometimes like you, I have been, get very interested in one single sentence in 4 paragraphs, just one sentence. And so I pulled that sentence out, and that's what I sent back to the writer saying, what about this sentence? And it sounds a little weird. I can see, like I'm nuts. Half the time I am. But it's one way that I can work on an idea that's different from everything else that I've read about that topic. And it focuses the writer a little bit also on what it is that we're looking for. I do the headline trick as well with our in-house columnists. What's the column about? Because by the time the column gets to me or the op-ed gets to me, I've probably read a lot about that. But our pieces tend to be about 600 words for Newsday and 400 words for AM New York. Depending on the piece, depending on the essay, I have ripped the pages and gone longer if the piece is timely and is well written. The other approach that I try is, if the piece doesn't work for me, and it happened with Liz, we were talking about this earlier, I'll send it back to you saying, what about this? This thing that you're not seeing in your piece. Are you willing to look at that? And if you're willing to look at that, I'm willing to work on it.
That just reminds me of a really quick story. I was doing a book column actually for Newsday, and got fired. I was very brokenhearted, but I wanted the book column was syndicated, so I wanted to try it for another paper. So I knew someone at the New York Post. So I called Vinny Musetto, who was famous for Headless Man and Topless Bar. He did that. So I called him and I said, "Would you do my book column? I have this great book column." He goes, "No, we don't care about books. What else do you know?" So I was like, "Uh-oh." He says, "Do you know performance art?" And then he said, "I got to take this call. Call me back." And he hangs up the phone at me, and I call a friend, and I'm like, "What's performance art?" And they're like, "It's really weird theater, like Blue Man Group." So I call him back, and he says, "So do you like performance art?" I go, "I love it. I like Blue Man Group." He goes, "That's my favorite. Good. Give me a list of 7 pieces you're going to do for me." For 4 years, I covered downtown theater. So if an editor needs something, or they're interested, or they throw it out at you, learn it. I think that's a really smart. I think that's really smart. If an editor, even if it's a different kind of piece than you want to pitch, if the editor's interested, you have somebody smart who's telling you what they need, improvise.
Right, and I think you should be open, right? Don't be offended, or don't take the criticism personally. Just go with it and see where it goes.
Yeah, and I remember I sent a piece to Melissa where I saw this movie. I was writing about going through infertility with my husband, and I saw this movie called Private Life, and I used that as a timely lead. And she came back to me and said, "Okay, but could you use it throughout?" And I was like, "What?" And I thought about it, and I thought, I don't think this will work, but I just, editor at New York Magazine, I loved her writing. I tried it, and everybody said it was like 1,000 times better. So is that like a common thing, that somebody will send you a piece and you'll say, "This doesn't quite work, but go this way"?
Yeah, I mean that's the whole job. Totally, and it's funny, not every writer is open to that. I just today might end up not being able to use the piece because I needed a change at the top, and the editor wrote me, or the writer wrote me back and was like, "Nah, I don't want to do that." So I'm like, "Okay, I don't want to publish it." So
Right.
Yeah, so you have to be just open to the changes that because the editor sees it in a way that you don't.
And also they know their publication so much better than you do.
Yeah.
Good. Now, Seth, I remember in my class, you wrote a few op-ed pieces in the New York Times that got published. So you wrote the whole piece, but when it comes to a nonfiction book, you have to do a proposal, right? So even though people were interested in you because you did The Frugal Traveler, I think you still had to do a proposal. Now, tell me if I'm wrong, but what I've been told for nonfiction proposals is you write the title, the subtitle, an overview of what the book is about, sample pages, a market analysis of other books that are similar, your bio, and how you're going to market it. So is it like, how many pages was your proposal? Do you remember?
Well, I sort of was a halfway point. I kind of got a little lucky. They came to me and said, "Are you working on any book-length projects?" And I said,
That was because they were reading your pieces
"That's
in the
right."
New York Times.
So this was probably a very unusual circumstance, but yet I still had to write a proposal. It was just shorter than the average proposal, and I didn't do a market proposal except for, "This is why the guy who did the column before me's book sold badly, but mine will sell well." That was pretty much the big question in the meeting. So I did about a 25-page. I did a sample chapter, and I did an intro basically, and that was it. But that's not so usual.
And I know that at a certain point when you were, not when you were doing op-ed pieces, but when you were doing third-person reported pieces, in that case you were pitching them, right? You weren't writing the whole piece, you were saying to Frank Flaherty or some of the other editors that you work with, would you like a piece about this thing that's going on?
And in that case, the pitches were really short. In fact, and of course the whole trick with pitching really short pitches is that in 2 paragraphs you have to show A, that you're a great writer, and B, that you have a really interesting story. So it's a real challenge. It's harder to do that in 2 paragraphs, and not 2 paragraphs of 17 sentences each. 2 paragraphs, short paragraphs, to show everything about you as a writer and about your subject in that amount of space is really tough, and they'll either see that you can do it or that you can't do it.
Great, and Dream Jordan, when you were writing your first YA book, did you write the entire book first, or did you pitch the book?
Yes, you have to write the entire book when it's a novel. Agents will not accept anything less. And I advise you to revise it at least once before you submit, and keep the faith.
And did you know the young adult market? Because, by the way, there's 50 different genres that one could write in. So, for example, there's middle grade, there's YA, there's new adult, there's adult books. So did you know the YA market well? Did you study it before you wrote your book?
No. But I have a really cool, hip voice, and so I tested my market with 7th and 8th graders. They loved it so much that I was actually the speaker for the graduation, and that fueled me to keep going when those rejections came in. So that's why I say this is a miracle book, because there was a lot of people saying no, and even I said no at one point. But I had unearthed these letters from the students who read my first 2 chapters, and they loved it so much that I said, the editors don't know, these are the people I want to reach, well, kids that I want to reach. So I do believe in getting an intended audience to test your work before submitting if possible.
Especially important for kids' books. Good advice. Now, Kate, I've been told for a memoir, it could go 2 ways, which is sometimes people can do a proposal for a memoir, but quite often it's easier just to write it. So you just wrote the whole book.
I wrote the whole book, and then I shopped it around, and I workshopped the book completely. I hired a book editor who helped me, and the book went through many drafts, and I could not get an agent. I kept querying agents. They were interested, they would look at the book, but no one was biting. I'm not sure why. So anyway, then I started thinking about going the small press route, and someone who I know had published with Heliotrope Books, which is my publisher, and he mentioned my book to the publisher of Heliotrope, which is like a hip downtown indie press. And that
I actually saw Naomi's here. Naomi, raise your hand.
Hi, Naomi.
That's our editor.
Hi, publisher.
Naomi Rosenblatt. There she is. Yay!
I figured that was a good fit for me since I'm a downtown indie person. And so Naomi published my book, and it was a great experience, and I even got to take the cover photo. That's my photo. I'm not on, people think this is me. It's not. I'm the photographer. I'm not in the photo. So it was great working with Naomi. It had a lot of input, and I would recommend that if you can't get an agent, try and publish with a small press.
Great. And now I'd like to ask everybody mistakes that you're seeing that people make, because we don't want to rush anything at 3 in the morning and send it to people on the panel. We want to make sure that we're doing it right. So Serene, what would you say the biggest mistake that you're seeing when people are contacting you? Is it that, are you getting writers who are contacting you too soon, or are you getting writers who are sending you like a biography and you don't handle biographies?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest mistake is not doing your research and sending me things that I just don't represent. And there's not much I can do. It's just not my area of expertise, so I'm going to say no. And in that line, it's also just you have to be prepared and write your query letter carefully. It's like a cover letter, so make sure you're addressing it right. You know, all those little things that aren't going to be an automatic no, but are going to make someone pause.
Do you you have a website? Because a lot of agents have a website, so you have to check and make sure that they handle the kind of book that you're interested in.
Yeah, definitely the website of the agency is the first place to start, but even just Googling the agent's name, because a lot of people will have social media, like I mention on Twitter often what I'm looking for, or I've done other interviews that talk about the types of books I do, so you'll be able to find more specific requests and interests if you do just a little bit of digging.
Great, and Deb, as I mentioned, I know just from my students, one of the mistakes they make with poetry and short story collections is they haven't published any of the pieces yet, but they think they want to get a book deal too quickly. Is that something common you see
I
in
don't see it so much.
Okay.
I mean, it's true that, of course, as we were saying, it's good to get your stuff out there and sort of, it helps you develop your voice to publish in journals, and because you're getting responses from journal editors who say, oh, this seems to be a really great direction for you, or I'd like to see more of this, and so I guess I would say, in a way, the most important thing for the kind of work I look at, which really is literary fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, is find what your own voice is. I mean, I get a lot of stuff that's really good, it's written well, I can tell the person has maybe an MFA, they've been through, the workshops, they've done all of that, but somehow it kind of sounds like everything else. And we all, of course, read so much and we love the written word so much, but if at the end of the day I'm not going to find it memorable and say, wow, I read something and it sounded like, well, like your work that you were saying the 7th graders loved, you obviously had a unique voice that was a little bit different from something that other people have already heard before. And sometimes it takes a while to find the right home for your own unique voice. But if you sound like everybody else, and say you have teachers who you love their work and you find yourself kind of imitating a little, that's not a bad way to learn. But in the end, you've got to find your own, be yourself. And it can take time to find that. But once you do, nobody else will sound like you and your work will be memorable and it will jump off the desk for people.
I had a mentor that once said that to me. They said, what did they say? They said, write what only you can write, and if someone else can write it, let them. So it's helped me.
Yeah.
And also I always tell my students, write about your obsessions, even if they're weird little quirky obsessions. That's better than what you think an editor wants. Melissa, let's talk about mistakes that people make with newspapers and magazines and New York Magazine. I know quite a few people that, for example, they try for Modern Love and it doesn't get in Modern Love, and then they'll just try for It's Complicated, and they didn't change it and they didn't understand the difference in tone. And also I get a lot of students that are like, see, I sent it to New York Magazine 4 days ago, I haven't heard, see, it doesn't work. And they don't follow up, and they have an unrealistic expectation that editors are going to jump at the chance. So could you talk about maybe some of the mistakes that writers are making?
My inbox stresses me out so much. I never write anymore, and I just wrote a piece last week that was just about email because I just had to say it. Oh my gosh, just try to have a little empathy for editors. Get just a crazy amount of email. That all of us are trying so hard to keep up with our submissions. There are columns we care about. We do read everything. We're just not going to read it all today because most of us also have writers on staff that we manage, and they have to come first. They do. So just just give me a minute, please.
Now, a lot of editors say if you send it Wednesday and you phone me Thursday and say, did you read it yet? I'll never want to deal with you again. What's an appropriate amount of time to follow up with you? Like 3 weeks or something?
I wrote about actually that we all have this different definition in our heads of what a reasonable amount of time is to respond to an email. I think for a pitch, a couple weeks is for me pretty good. Which I know from being on the other side when I freelance, it feels like ages, But just I think just trust that we're gonna get to it. All of us answer every single email. We just don't answer it right away, but we answer every single email. And then the other thing about the tone, like I was talking about before. The cut really places a lot of emphasis on humor and self-awareness, like I was kind of saying before. And if a piece doesn't have that, it just doesn't belong with us. So so it's just a matter of really knowing who you're pitching to.
Good. Now, Eli, I was just talking to a student who wrote an op-ed that he thought was a great op-ed, but when I asked him, it seemed as if he didn't have a platform for the subject. And it seems to me, because I've written a lot of op-eds, which is, it really pisses me off when, but it seems to me that most of my op-eds have been first person, or I have really, and you don't need a PhD to have an expertise. Just for an example, I'm a former pothead and I used to chain smoke, so anytime there's like anything going on about cannabis or about, smoking laws or vaping, I say, well, I'm an expert because I used to do that, But it does seem like to me, most of the pieces that you wind up taking have some first person connection. So just for an example, none of my students ever published a piece on the war in Iraq or Afghanistan, because the only people that ever had luck with that were veterans who had first person experience. So do you get pieces where someone doesn't have the right platform?
It happens more often than I would like. But I think it's a situation like someone writing about a war, to follow your example. We read so much of that, and there's so many established folks who write about that every week, almost, to some extent, that it has to be really good. So I did take one. It's a former Marine who served in Afghanistan, if I remember correctly, and he is now going back to school.
Well, by the way, that's a perfect platform to write about a war, right?
And that's why I took that, because he brought to this something completely different that no academic at Brookings or whatever think tank could bring, all due respect. But I look for voice more than anything else, which is typically not the way I think most op-ed editors work. It's always public policy, very heavy Texas, every time. And that's serious and that's important. But I look for voice, because if you have a voice, then you can carry an argument. And I can help you formulate the argument, but it's hard to give you a voice. And I think for pitches, a couple of things you should not do is expect that I'm going to answer by the afternoon. Expect that I will be okay if my rejection email comes back with a response that says, I just don't understand, I'm just not that smart. It's probably true. Or that doesn't even bother to know that my first name is a boy's name. It's not a girl's name. So I cannot tell you how many times, Mrs. Reyes, come on, do a little, just Google, just geez.
I'll tell you a mistake that I think I made. I didn't get, even though I was publishing when I was young in my 20s, I didn't get my first book until my 40s. And I wrote several books, and I think I wrote a book, and then I would bring it in my writing group, and then I would send it to agents, both fiction and nonfiction, and I thought it was ready. And at a certain point, I was turning 40, I had a whole bunch of students who were publishing books when I couldn't, so I was complaining to my shrink that I was like the wedding planner who couldn't get married. If I remember correctly, $2,500. I did a credit card, I taught an extra class to pay for it, I was very nervous, and then I sold my first book to Random House for $50,000, and there were 7 foreign rights, film, TV, and I'm on book 14, and now I swear by ghost editors. So I will say one mistake that I didn't figure out was I didn't ask enough questions early on. I was rushing to send out books before they were ready, and if anybody's interested, you can take one of my cards. There are several fantastic ghost editors who work in each genre. So the best thing would be if you could take a class, if you could be in an MFA program or a journalism school, that's fantastic. But or even a great writing group. But if you're working in a vacuum, don't just write something, decide it's brilliant, send it someplace. There are other ways that you could have an expert go over it and just say to you, is it ready? And when I talk to ghost editors, they've never said to someone, oh, this is ready to send out. There's always things that one could do to work on it. So anyway, Seth, you've helped a lot of people, a lot of my students who want to do travel pieces, pitch travel stuff. What's the biggest mistake that you see in travel? I know some of my students, they go to Korea and they write a 7,000 word piece and they think Travel and Leisure should publish their first person piece about what a great time they had in Korea, and nobody ever buys that piece. So what are they doing wrong? Is it that it's not service oriented?
There's a big mistake in travel writing, which is that it's about travel, but it's really about writing. Travel writing is a great way to break into publications because there's no prior qualifications needed. In fact, being ignorant is often great. One of my favorite pieces I ever did was about China. I knew nothing. I failed in every possible way, and I learned a lot about it. So I'd say the biggest mistake is not to have not to try to be original in your idea. Going to Korea is not an idea. Going up the Yangtze River in a ferry boats taken only by Chinese people and writing about the cultural exchanges you have with them, that's an idea. And even then, you have to be very careful when you're writing to avoid travel cliches. Rolling hills. There should be no rolling hills. And realize that if you're not a travel writer, you can still write about travel, but you have to read a lot of travel writing to avoid some of these crazy pitfalls. That goes for everything, in fact, obviously.
Right, but one of the things that I loved about Frugal Traveler was it was service-oriented,
Right.
meaning that you were helping other people. And I'll never forget, you did a column once about how to get free plane tickets, and you suggested there were credit cards where you could get $50,000 miles if you got a new credit card. So I went out and got it. I needed a new computer, so I charged the American Express. I charged a new computer. So I spent, I think it was $3,000. I got 50,000 miles, got a round trip ticket, and then never used the credit card again. But anyway, so I love when I read tips. Like service-oriented, helping people. So when you do Frugal Traveler, it seems as if the tone of that wasn't, I did this cool thing, but here's how you could do it.
I did both. I did both. And it is true that if you can think of a really good idea that you don't even need to travel for, that's even better. Like, it just drives me crazy in New York when you go to a cafe and they turn around the iPad and you have a choice of a 40% or an 80% tip. So I got curious about, like, well, what's it like in other cities and other countries? So now I'm doing a piece on that. Nobody steal that, please. Sorry. And that's the sort of thing, if you think of an idea when you're traveling, anything you wonder, like, why, could I do this better, that could easily be a piece, and service pieces do work really, really.
Good. Dream Jordan, a lot of my students, when they try to do kids' books, I feel like they're not doing research. So for example, somebody once gave me like a 60-page book and said, this is a picture book, check it out, and I'm gonna do the pictures too. And it was like, wait a second, I think picture books are 1,000 words, and I think that editors pick you don't get to draw your own pictures unless you're Raz Chast. I think that, editors decide. So did it take you a while to figure out how to sell your YA books? And are there any mistakes that you made getting there?
I would say the first mistake I made was thinking I was going to be Terry McMillan. So the first thing you need to do is love what you're doing, or else don't do it. So don't do it for the money. You have to know that you love this and you have a purpose. I did a lot of research for my book. I have never been in foster care, and the biggest compliment I received was a child thinking I was in foster care and saying I can relate to your story. So I would advise you to thoroughly research your subject matter, believe in it, and the reason I keep turning to Kate, my character's name is Kate, so when you say Kate, I'm like, is this still me? But Kate really lives, like, it's a wonderful character because I did the research.
Good. And Kate Walter, I know that you've taught essay writing for a long time and you've helped quite a few of your students get published. We're on a Facebook group together, and one of the things I noticed that I love it when you answer is someone will say, I have this 8,000 word essay, where should I send it? And you always say, too long. Who wants 8,000 words? So is that one of the mistakes that people make, is that if they want to publish essays, they're not paying attention to word length that editors want?
Yes, and people tend to send stuff out before it's ready, which of course Sue and I have talked about, and I always urge my students, don't send it out until, I've workshopped it with you in class and you've gotten feedback, etc. The other thing I did want to say, what Eli said about voice, I've written a lot of pieces for AM New York. Eli's great to work with, and I do think having a voice is really, really important when you're writing first-person pieces. You have to have a distinctive voice, and I think that's why I've had success. I also agree with Sue about writing about stuff that pisses you off, and one of my favorite stories was that I could not get a credit card. This was a really long time ago, and I was so frustrated when I came out of the bank. I mean, this was like way back when, like in the 80s or 90s. And afterwards, I wrote a piece for the New York Times about how I couldn't get a credit card. And then I went back to the bank and I said, look at this, and I got a credit card. And another time, I could not get the insurance company to pay for therapy because I wasn't sick and crazy enough. And that led to one of my best first lines, which was like, I might have to commit suicide or at least attempt it to get my insurance company to pay for therapy. That also, I think, led not only to them paying for it, but I think it led to some change. And my therapist said the piece was in some anthologies that the other therapists read. So you can really affect a lot of stuff, even though you're not making a ton of money. I mean, you get a credit card, you get them to pay for your therapy. And it's always stuff that's going on that I just see, and it's like, oh my God. And that's the kind of stuff that I write about in my opinion pieces.
Cool. Okay, last question. I'll ask everybody, what kind of advice do you give a group of people who I think everybody wants to publish books and get top literary agents and get published in good places? So Serene, what advice would you give if somebody's before somebody contacts you or another literary agent? So I love what you said, go to the website, make sure that you're contacting the right agent for the right material.
I think when you're ready to start querying, again, do your research, make sure you're sending it to the right people just to increase your chances. Be polite and be understanding, and like Melissa was saying, we get a lot of emails, and just realize that we're also people working as hard as we can. We're on your side. We're not the enemy. We want to help you, and we want to publish.
What's an
really good
appropriate
books.
amount of time once somebody has sent a proposal or a book to follow up with an agent? A couple months, or
maybe even like a month. Like a lot of agencies will say on their website how much time they need, and if they don't, some people have asked, like we don't specifically. We might. I'm not sure what our website says. So people have asked me, when can I expect a response? And I'll tell them, 6 to 8 weeks, but feel free to follow up anytime. So I'm open to having that conversation, and you are as well. So
my trick is if I send in a whole book or a proposal, my trick is that I then try to do a short piece in a splashy place like Newsday or New York Times or New York Magazine and follow up with that. Yeah. So that's a good way to follow up. I just wanted to show you my latest piece, and then sometimes they
I've even had people follow up with like, oh hey, I saw this really interesting article and it relates to what I'm writing about. I thought you'd be, interested, and that's totally fine. And I may or may not get to your book faster, but it does keep your name on my mind. So.
Great. And Deb, I love what you said about that you spent 10 years working as an assistant until, and that wound up leading to, to great positions. So do you have any advice to people who either want to do what you're doing, which is being an editor, or
well, I think with both writing and editing, I guess I would say whatever it is that you dream to do, and if it's becoming a writer, for me, it's been really important to not only do one thing. Like, don't get a laptop and sit in a room and say, okay, I'm a writer. I mean, you travel and have experiences and go on, you went on all these different pathways to find what your voice was going to be about. And I always feel with young writers, it's so important to, I don't know, teach bar classes, work in a coffee shop, go on a, journey in China, do whatever you need to do part of it is just practical. You got to pay the rent, and you're not paying the rent yet as a writer. And most writers that I work with, by the way, who are really successful and have multiple books, don't pay the rent as a writer either, by the way. So you need to do other things with your life, and through those things and those experiences and the people in your life, you will find your voice, you will find your subject, like a lot of serendipity. And I don't know, for me it was always important to have another life on top of the life that I was, anyway.
Yeah, one of my students, Marcy Alboa, wrote a book called One Person, Multiple Career, and she thinks that's the wave of the future. And there's quite a few authors by day, teachers by night, but it's a really great thing, and sometimes that other field leads you to your book, which is great. Yeah, great advice. Melissa, what kind of advice do you give writers starting out now?
I mean, I kind of alluded to this earlier, but I just think it's so important to develop some kind of expertise in a subject. I'm so glad I stumbled into like health science psychology. It turns out I'm obsessed with it. It's kind of a passion, but I just, I'll at work sometimes I'll go to pitch meetings and there'll be writers who don't really have a beat, and I'm like, how on earth could you come up with a story idea if like the whole world was yours to choose from? So I think just like developing expertise in a particular subject and becoming known for writing about that has helped me.
Good. Eli.
So general proposition, 3 things. 1, why are you writing where you're writing? I mean, be surprised how many pieces I'll speak for me, I get to see that don't tell me why are you writing this, right? It's the old newspaper thing about having an autograph. 2, why are you pitching this publication or me? why would this be a good fit for you? And if you cannot answer those two things, you need to go back to your first step and try to figure that out, because it'll be a waste of time of a pitch. If it's not for us, if you don't know who we are, what we stand for, our standards, it just won't happen. And the last thing I'll say, which I say often when we get together, not that anybody here would, plagiarism. Plagiarism. It's happened before. I've been doing this for a very long time. The most egregious example was the top 3 or 4 paragraphs of a piece. Exactly the same paragraphs that appeared in a Wall Street Journal story. I read a lot. And if I happen to have missed it, there's Google for that. So, writers spend, days, weeks, months trying to find the right paragraph, the right chapter, the right 800 words. It's a bit insulting to just kind of grab their stuff. And so.
And you once told my class, you put it succinctly, you said, why you, why me, why now? I love that. Seth, advice that you give, especially if people want to do travel writing. So what advice do you give?
One thing is I'm not going to copy his answer. I think that my number one piece of advice, probably everyone out there today has had some idea that would be a great piece or a great travel piece or a great op-ed piece or even a great book, and you just don't recognize that you had that idea. So I think that's the difference. Now I go to yoga. I used to be like, I can't think, I gotta concentrate on yoga. But now I'm like, I get like 5 ideas for articles during every torturous yoga class, and I often have to keep like a mnemonic device to remember the 5 ideas I had during yoga, because you can't bring in your notepad. So I'd say that, just start to recognize when the thought you have, you tell your partner, or you write it in a journal, or you scream inside your own head. Those could all be great articles. You just have to start recognizing.
Good. If you don't mind, Dream Jordan, aside from advice, you have a really interesting story. A lot of my students say, what if I don't want to put my name on a piece? And my first assignment, I teach these classes, the instant gratification takes too long method, where the goal is to write and publish a great piece by the end of the class. And my first assignment is write a humiliation essay. Some people do not want to put their name on it. And if you don't mind me saying, you use a pseudonym. So could you talk about that a little bit? Is that a good idea sometimes for people?
Yes. So the reason I did is because I published a piece in Essence, and the person actually tracked me down. So yeah, tracked me down at my job, and I really just want to stay private after that. So Dream Jordan is my pen name. As for advice, I have a short and powerful list, and I hope you really receive this, and I applaud all of you for pursuing your passion. Never take rejection personal. It's an opportunity to revise your approach. Study your craft. Believe in yourself. Be open to critical feedback, and love the process.
Great. Kate, what advice could you add to what we've said? By the way, taking a class is
I was just going to
great.
say, take classes, always revise your stuff. Don't send out stuff unless it has gone through some kind of feedback. If you don't have a group, then get a friend. I'm lucky I belong to a wonderful group, and I get a lot of feedback in the group, but I also have a few other friends who I send my stuff out to. So I would never send anything out. Well, some of the stuff I do for Eli, I do because it's very, very short, and I know, at this point, I think I know what he wants. But I'm saying the longer pieces, I would never send out unless it goes through a workshop process. So that's my advice. Take classes, workshop the stuff, and then send it out.
Great. Okay, so now I want you guys to hear some really beautiful short pieces that people did for my classes and my workshops. Sybil Sage is reading a piece that she published in the Boston Globe. She's a TV writer for Barney Miller, Magnum PI, Northern Exposure, and she's working on a funny memoir about how while she was writing for major feminists like Maude and Mary Tyler Moore and Lily Tomlin, all she really wanted to do was get married and have kids. So it's actually in page 213, and if you want to stand up and read it. Turn to the audience. 213.
Go ahead and answer. Why don't you all read it into page 213? Okay. Family Trumpster.
A liberal learns to accept the family Trumpster.
With enough political buttons strewn about for our apartment to pass as Democratic headquarters, I assumed my 35-year-old nephew was teasing at a recent Sunday brunch when he volunteered Donald Trump as the best candidate. This was in 2016. What makes you say that, I asked, expecting he'd snicker. Because he'll surround himself with good people, was his answer. Like Chris Christie, I scoffed? Or David Duke? How could I be hearing this from the adorable dimpled nephew whose every birthday, graduation, and marathon I taped? I realized I just served hand-sliced smoked salmon at $29.98 a pound to a Trump fan. The rest of us banded into a unit of Nova-noshing Navy SEALs charged with saving our country from a threat. I'd been the first to deploy, but my son, a 32-year-old attorney, parachuted in to ask, "Have you considered what he could do to the Supreme Court?" The nephew shrugged, as if that were not an issue. My son continued, "Look, even if you have problems with Hillary, you have to admit she's the most qualified." The nephew remained quiet, which prompted my son to point out, "If you don't care about women's rights, you should." His reward was approving smiles from his wife and me. Politics have always been important to me. When I met my future husband, Jimmy Carter was in office. Before we did anything that might transmit germs, I made sure he was a liberal. I wasn't about to share a bed or the TV remote, let alone raise a child with a Republican. My husband's entire family, like mine, was solidly Democratic, but my nephew's stance was evidence that genetics guarantees nothing. Desperate to understand how my nephew had been seduced, I messaged a relative in Florida who'd liked the Donald J. Trump page on Facebook. "You have no problem voting for a man who was praised by Louis Farrakhan for not accepting money from the Jews?" Maybe she'd be more explicit and articulate. "Okay," she replied, "here goes. Hillary? She was in the White House for 4 years. What did she do?" So much for that plan. I restrained myself from pointing out that Hillary was there for 8 years and her role was as a first plus one. All politics is local, so I decided to question people I encountered as I roamed around. I took my listening tour to different parts of the city, bringing up the election at every opportunity. The man sitting next to me on the bus said, "He's the only one who gives me hope." A tourist asking for directions insisted that the billionaire is unafraid, perceiving Trump as an alpha leader capable of reinvigorating the country. I imagined there were many who confused brashness and bragging with strength. In my dentist waiting room, a woman getting an implant was convinced the man whose Chicago hotel minibar includes a $25 bottle of water will make America great again. My teeth clenched, making it almost impossible for the dental hygienist to clean them. She repeated, pleaded, "Can you open any wider?" Someone working in a bakery who moved here from Guatemala admitted she'd hoped Trump would win because he tells it like it is. "You don't care that he's anti-immigrants?" I asked. "Not Guatemalans," was her response. "It's Mexicans he hates." The survey didn't help me come to terms with my nephew's position, but other family events were coming up, and I was eager to get back to the warm relationship I'd always had with him. In fact, I'm still hoping he'll agree not to vote for a Republican in return for the anonymity I'm giving him here. Though I'd failed to figure out what he saw in Trump, maybe I could at least understand why he'd made that announcement to us. He had to know it would be provocative. Psychologists attribute many personality traits to birth order. From what I read, it was conceivable my nephew had middle child syndrome. Sandwiched between an older and a younger sibling, he may have felt invisible or neglected. Maybe I was even partly responsible. Had I played enough games with him as a child? His brunch declaration may have given him a moment as Speaker of the House, even if it was only his aunt and uncle's house. These realizations, rationalizations, allowed me to stop conflating the candidate and his follower. I could loathe one and love the other. Respectful, sensitive, and kind, my nephew is like the Donald. And I'm sure he'll happily show me his tax returns. And then everything gets dated. I wonder how Paul Ryan's aunt is handling her nephew's endorsement.
Sybil Sage. Now we're going to hear Bruno, and he's a copywriter who's been published in by Eli in Newsday, and he's reading his humiliation essay, the first piece he published in Newsweek.
My turn, coming out to my dad twice. "Hey there, are you a man or a woman?" my father asked the stocky girl in navy blue coveralls as we rode the elevator down to the hospital lobby. 80 years old and wandering in the abyss of mid-stage Alzheimer's, Dad used to pride himself on what he didn't say. I, at 42, unmarried and the youngest of 3 brothers, was now his partial caretaker, making frequent trips across the Hudson to the hospital near my childhood home in New Jersey. Until recently, Dad's illness was all about frustration. He drove his mouse gray Buick Century into cars that had stopped short. He got lost on trips to the store. He forgot his grandkids' names. But this new phase of filter-free wonderment was relatively refreshing, if only for its lack of guile. That is, until he aimed it at me as I drove him home. "Hey, where do you live?" He asked everyone this, even my mother. "Manhattan," I answered. "Do you live in a big building? Have I been there?" He had, even though he hated that city, the one to which he used to commute daily. "Okay, so what do you do?" he demanded. "I'm a magazine editor," I responded. "Nice." In his lucid years, Dad never grasped why I'd want to toil for so little when I could just take over his insurance agency and write on the side, as if my craft were some sort of high-class hobby. "Got a dog?" "No," I said, sighing. 2 cats, Steve and Edie. These were tedious but easy questions I always answered. Maybe he'll stop soon, I thought. But he didn't. "Are you married?" "No." "You a gay?" "Yes, I am." I had come out to my parents when I was 31 during Easter dinner. For a few years, I had been openly gay with friends, coworkers, and anyone who asked, but not with them. In the closet to parents, though, was a flaming red flag on the is he a desirable date checklist. When I finally dropped the G-bomb, my mother responded with the same level of open-mindedness that once inspired her to take a mind expansion class in the 70s and to play a karate-chopping housewife in a local production of Sondheim's Company. Dad, the Moose Lodge mainstay, was stammering, blushing, and mumbling sotto voce sentence fragments laced with words like disgusting and unnatural, all delivered while staring intensely at a butter dish. "It's just easier for you to know, end of story," I had said. A couple of hours later, he drove me to the bus, prattling on about great moments in stock trading and commercial real estate, just like he had on so many Sundays before. He didn't mention the gay thing again for a dozen years. Now, on the way back from the hospital, he summed up our staccato volley. "So you live with strangers, you're a gay, you write things and like cats. Is that everything?" There wasn't any judgment being made. He was simply cheerfully gathering the facts. It was. "Yes, Dad, that's all." And it felt all right. This time around, there was no sputtering or stammering. Sure, much of it had to do with the layers of plaque on his brain's misfiring synapses, which stole the emotion from his words. But to some degree, his tragic illness may have provided him with relief from his anxiety, and me the confirmation of a long-standing hunch. Yes, maybe this was his version of, "I don't get you, but that's fine." If so, it was a moment of candor I had imagined for a very long time. I just never knew how we'd get there, if ever. And I recalled that, to his credit, he had supported most of my endeavors, from gathering old radios to acting in community theater, despite not understanding any of it. Until now, he had muted his bemusement. Surely it is a rare opportunity to come out to a parent twice. Some never get around to doing it once. At one point, it occurred to me that if this interrogation thing had happened yet again, maybe I could revise my autobiography a bit. Add in an enduring wife and kids, a spunky German shepherd, and a bad knee from my gridiron days at Penn State. That way, I could avoid this Groundhog Day of reliving one of the more difficult moments of my life. As it turned out, though, the conversation never happened again. But that was okay. We had finally gotten the talk just right anyway.
And Ms. Montgomery is a nurse who's published pieces in AM New York and Honeysuckle, and she's working on a novel, and she's reading a piece on page 197. It's her first publication.
One thing Netflix show Girlfriend's Guide to Divorce doesn't cover is how to date when you're a 46-year-old woman, twice divorced, and recovering from abdominal cancer with a feeding tube in your arm. This was not the first time in the past 7 years that I needed the 12-hour feedings, but it was the first time I decided to date in that condition. My 78-year-old mother, Teresa, who cared for me, called me foolish for being on Tinder. She wanted me to focus on recovering, not love. I rolled my eyes and decided to meet Alan, a dermatologist from Manhattan. My mom was concerned, and looking back, I can see why. I weighed 85 pounds at 5'7", but I wanted to feel normal again, if only for a night. The sweater dress I wore camouflaged the catheters. We met at a hotel near my Manhattan apartment. My mom watched me walk to the hotel, worried I might collapse. Alan, a rotund 42-year-old, was at the bar having just ordered appetizers to share. I explained I had eaten dinner and ordered a Pinot Noir. He asked me questions about my life as the room began to spin. When I said something funny, he hit my arm right where the catheter was. Then he did it again, and a third time. Finally, I said, "Ouch, I hurt myself working out yesterday, be careful." He questioned, "You aren't one of those skinny girls addicted to working out, are you?"
So awkward.
As I lay down in my bed with my mom beside me. We talked like two schoolgirls about boys until I fell asleep, happy for the first time in a long time. I proved to myself that it didn't matter what I looked like, I was still me on the inside. I no longer need intravenous feedings, but I'm still looking for love with my mom's blessing.
Again, our last reader of the night is Victor Varnado, who is a stand-up comic, and he's reading a piece he published. I think it was The Humiliation Essay, published it in Salon, and he's working on a comic memoir called Colorblind, and this is on page 69 of Byline Bible.
69, everybody. Nice. I stole a white girl and took her to prom. My prom date's parents had no idea their white daughter would spend the evening with a black man. For starters, they didn't know I was black. As an African-American man born with albinism, I have seen the look of awareness creep across faces when people set aside their initial assessment based on my light skin and hair, and finally figure out that I am black. As they come to terms with this realization, their silent reactions range from harmless, "Well, I'll be, I had no idea you even existed," to the irrational, "I've been betrayed, why did you trick me?" Moments like these have plagued my life. For me, high school began with ostracism. I was teased about my very light hair and skin, lazy eye, and Coke bottle glasses. But as I matured from a terrified freshman to a more confident senior, my classmates' attitude toward me transformed dramatically. The most important change for me was that suddenly women didn't find me revolting. The first thing I wanted to do with my newly acceptable level of attractiveness was ask my friend Kate to prom. Kate had dark hair, a great sense of humor, boobs, and combat boots. Everything that at 18 I felt was important. Although she listened to better music than I did, she liked the Replacements while I liked Aha, Kate did think I was cool enough to hang out with intermittently. Sometimes we met for lunch in the concrete commons area separating the two buildings, comprising Minneapolis North High School's campus. We would slowly chew breaded chicken breasts while criticizing everyone else's clothes. Before asking Kate out, I watched her from inside the glass double doors of the southern building until I could slow down my breathing enough to feel normal. I left the safety of the doorway and asked, "Will you go to prom with me?" She paused, looked surprised, smiled, and then agreed to the date. Every time I saw her for the next day, she smiled or blushed. I wondered if this was what dating feels like. Then, the following afternoon, Kate greeted me in the lunchroom with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. Although we were surrounded by cafeteria commotion, it felt like she and I were alone. My parents won't let me go to prom with you," she stammered. "Why?" I was so confused. "Because you're black." She said it like maybe I should have known. I was genuinely surprised. My whole life, people shunned me for looking different, but never for my race. Apparently, when Kate told her parents she had been asked to prom, she pointed me out in the yearbook to her mother, who thought I was different looking, but nice enough. Her father, on the other hand, took one look at my photo and had questions. "What is he asked. Kate said that I was black, that both my parents are black through a genetic anomaly. They produced a child like me. The look on Kate's face filled in the rest of the story. She turned around and left the lunchroom as quickly as she could. I was left standing alone, surrounded by everyone I knew. That evening, I broke the news to my friends Dave and Pete. The three of us had planned to triple date to the prom. We were renting a limo together. Now with Kate pulling out of our date, our entire evening was harpooned. But I've always been a fan of John Hughes movies, especially his romantic comedies like 16 Candles. Molly Ringwald took an incredible risk before landing her true love, so why couldn't I come up with my own madcap scheme to win Kate's heart? What would happen if I sent one of my incredibly white friends to Kate's house on prom night? Maybe I could fool her parents into thinking she was going to the dance with a safe Caucasian male. Pete and Dave were in. I just had to pick my proxy. Pete was my hunkiest buddy. His father was an ex-Marine and his brother was a fireman. He came from Nordic stock. Every time a new attractive girl moved to our school district, it was inevitable that he would end up in bed with her. Was I handing Kate over to him? Pete was definitely not the guy for the job. Dave was a tall and nerdy German kid with blonde hair. Sorry, Dave passed away just recently. That sucks. Dave was a tall and nerdy... Sorry, you guys. Okay, Dave was a tall and nerdy German kid with blonde hair and thick glasses. I would find out later that Dave got more action than anybody, but at the time, he made me feel safe. The next day, I presented the idea to Kate over lunch. She was flabbergasted at the plan for Dave to be our ethnic beard, but she agreed to play along. On the night of the dance, Dave, Pete, their dates, and I all arrived outside of Kate's house in a limo. I had picked a cummerbund and bow tie to match Kate's blue dress, so Dave and I switched our tuxedo accessories to avoid any suspicion. Pete and I watched from the limousine as Kate's father greeted Dave and ushered him into their living room for pictures. It was surreal. Part of me felt so smart that I had come up with a way to trick Kate's parents. I also felt like a creep hiding in the car while a white guy posed with my prom date. Eventually, Kate and Dave emerged and jumped into the limo. I stayed hidden until the car door closed and we were all safe behind privacy glass. Once Dave and I switched our accessories back, Kate and I sat next to each other, awkwardly, not touching at all. That evening, we danced, we bowled, and we held hands. By the end of the night, as the limo dropped other kids off one by one, Kate and I had grown bold. We pulled up outside of Kate's house. We stood on her sidewalk. If Kate's mother had looked out of her window right then, she would have seen us. Kate and I leaned in for a kiss. We may have been too excited because we bumped teeth. We were both too embarrassed to correct our mistakes, so the fumbled kiss was all we had. Years later, when Kate was in her early 20s and sitting in the back of her parents' station wagon on a family trip, she decided it was time to tell them that she spent prom with that black kid who didn't really look black. Her father kept driving but screamed, "What?" in an exaggerated cartoon fashion. He wasn't a fan. Kate's mother responded just the way a movie mom might. "I knew it," she said, laughing. Kate and I didn't end up together, but the part of our short relationship that I kept has affected my dealings with intimacy since. Life rewarded me for taking a chance. My experience with Kate became a seminal moment. Risk became my blueprint for how relationships that were worth it began. Most of the time, seizing the moment led to something exceptional. When I sparked a conversation on Facebook with a woman I'd never met, she asked if I would meet her in New Orleans after she finished with her stint rebuilding houses shortly after Hurricane Katrina. I agreed. We met for the first time at a boutique hotel on Bourbon Street and enjoyed 3 days of dancing, jazz, gumbo, and gambling. We toured an almost empty aquarium in the midst of being restocked after the storm. Since the rules were lax, I got to pet my first penguin. Of course, taking chances has sometimes led to terrible things. But even though I woke up to an empty wallet and a missing phone after almost a week of hanging out with a poet from Kansas, who to this day swears she will pay me back, I still enjoyed the conversation, the affection, and joy she gave me before she robbed me blind.
Okay, thanks to Sybil, Sage, Rhonda, Bruno, Liz Montgomery, and Victor Varnado. We have time for a few quick questions. So anybody have questions? Yes?
I can just stand.
Yes.
This goes to the editors and to Serene, the agent. What do you do with someone who's not... Thank you. What do you do with someone who's not a native English speaker, but who does have a very unique, special story that you want to publish, but they need someone to go with them, through them?
By the way, I'll just quickly tell you that I co-authored a book with a Bosnian war survivor because English wasn't his first language. So there is such thing as you could do a co-author or a ghostwriter. What do you guys? What do you guys think?
Yeah, I was gonna say. I mean, it depends. If you're planning on writing in English, then I think the best bet would be to find someone to either work with you on it and co-author it. Otherwise, if you're planning on writing in your native language, then having sample translations, at least for us to read it, would be the place to start.
Deb?
I do publish work in translation, so I have to see a significant amount that's translated in order to figure out if it's going to work.
Interesting. Other questions? Yes?
Hi there. I'm working on an incredible book called Mom's Little Time Waster. It's an activity book for moms who just had a new baby, and they're really sad, and all they do is sit around and do activities in this book. So my question is, how could I pitch a book like that that's really activity-based? And I mean, it has, there is a premise to it.
What age is it for?
New moms, all ages.
Yeah, I think you need a book proposal. So write a book proposal, write a 30-page book proposal. I mean, self-help is very similar to all nonfiction.
Even with art, though the book is mostly art-based.
I would do a book proposal, and I would actually use some of the art for the proposal. What do you think?
Well, I always think with a certain kind of book, if you look for other books that are somewhat in your genre and look in the acknowledgments and see who represents them. I mean, you can sort of stalk someone who's an author who's doing something that you like. Find out who their agent is and who represents the kind of work that you're, because an agent will know what to do with it, but you need to find an agent who does that kind of stuff. So go in that section of the bookstore, look in the back of every book and see who they thank as their agent.
And by the way, it's in that case, I think publishing a short piece of it in someplace splashy would be a great way to start. I had one student who was doing feminist erotic literature, published a piece in the New Yorker. The whole thing took off and she got a book deal very, very quickly. So if you were to publish a part of it in a good place, that could bring editors and agents to you, I think.
I just want to say, I think it would be helpful if you were pitching to an agent and you've got like this graphic element. If you can, sometimes it depends how their query system is. You might not be able to attach that image, but if you've got samples, that's going to be really helpful. Even if you don't have the whole thing done, but because it's activity-based, I need to see what those activities are. So try and include it.
Yes.
I know Jessica, she's an awesome writer. I just want to say that just my fiance has published 3 books like that. If you talk to me, I will hook you up with her.
Cool. Final question. Yes.
How important, well, you guys talked about in nonfiction proposals, you talked about the importance of the marketing, but in fiction proposals, I know there's something called comparisons or comparables, I think, and how important are those? I guess it's
Serene and Deborah, how important if somebody's a novelist, how important is it for them to know what are comparable titles?
I personally think it's important, not the most important part, but it is helpful, if anything, just so that we know you've thought about your book in a larger sense. Where is it going to sit on the shelf? And it does help us start to think, okay, who am I going to send to? How do I position this? Yeah.
Debbie.
I would just say I'm probably the rare editor who hates comps more than anything. I think it's really important to know what your comps are to find the right agent. But then for me, I think a book is great because it's unique and individual. So even though an agent will send it to me and will say, you'll like it, Deb, because you like this, these comps. What I want to find when I turn to the first page is, again, that it's just different from anything else. And I give comps for my books to my sales force kind of over my own objection because I like what's most individual about each book.
I'll just add one thing is that I have several students who have published novels, and the editors and agents both said the fact that they were able to publish short essays on the topic of their book is what made them so interested. So if there's any autobiographical element that you have in your book, in fact, Daniela, what's the name of your book coming out?
Her daughter's mother.
Her daughter's mother, and it's coming out from?
It's coming out from Putnam, June 18th.
Coming out from Putnam. It's a former student of mine, and you are now working on essays because there's some elements of her book that are autobiographical.
Yes, and I had already published a few essays on that topic.
Yeah, so it's a really smart thing to do, and I've actually heard book editors say part of the reason I took this is because you're someone that can market, and also when you have a book come out, there is no better book publicity than you publishing a splashy piece in a great place, and then at the bottom it says the name of your book. So you might want to, while you're looking for agents, you might want to also see is there a 3-page essay, because it could be a long process looking for an agent. Anyway, you guys, I wanted to thank John Turner at NYU